Well, good afternoon, and for those of us joining us from Pacific time, good morning, and welcome to the Holland & Hart Health Law webinar series. My name is Derek Curl. I'm a partner at Holland & Hart, and I'm presenting with my colleague today, Corey Talbot, also a partner at Holland & Hart. Today, we'll be covering cybersecurity in healthcare, what HHS wants you to know and to do. So we'll be talking about the HHS's recent release of cybersecurity guidance and practices to the healthcare industry. By way of introduction, I have been at Holland & Hart for about 10 years, and before that I was with a national firm. I specialize in representing businesses in complex litigation, and I also follow and present on cybersecurity and data privacy issues.
And hi, my name is Corey Talbot. As Derek said, I'm a partner at Holland & Hart as well. I've been practicing for almost 20 years in commercial litigation, antitrust, and healthcare law. So happy to be here today, and hopefully we'll be able to give you some good insight and guidance on the most recent guidance we have from HHS.
Well, perfect. Just our contact information is there, as you can see, and feel free to reach out to us either to connect with us on LinkedIn or by email. Just so you are aware, this presentation is being recorded, and the recording and materials from this presentation will be available at www.hhhealthblog.com by clicking on the webinar recording tab there. And if you have any questions during the presentation, we invite you to submit them, and we will address those towards the conclusion of our presentation today. Just to give you an idea of a roadmap of where we're headed today, on today's agenda, we'll give you an overview of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services' new cybersecurity guidance, including key aspects to be aware of. We'll be discussing the most current and common cybersecurity threats outlined in the guidance and how to address them within your organizations. And we'll also cover some best cybersecurity practices to keep in mind. So to kick off here, at the end of last year, HHS released a publication called the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices, Managing Threats and Protecting Patients, or the HICP, or HICCUP, if you like, guidance. The HICCUP guidance and publication was developed in response to the Cybersecurity Act's mandate to develop practical cybersecurity guidelines and best practices and procedures to cost-effectively reduce cybersecurity risks in the healthcare industry. This was the product of a 2-year public-private partnership by over 150 cybersecurity and healthcare experts from industry and government, including the healthcare and public health sector coordinating councils. A lot of work went into this, a lot of thought, and the goal of HICCUP was to outline practical cybersecurity best practices for a diverse and vast industry in order to improve security and safety of patients and to cost-effectively reduce risks within health organizations of all sizes, from your local clinic to your major multi-state healthcare system. So that is the aim of this guidance, which is published. I think it's important to point out that HHS in the publication stated specifically that cybersecurity remains a top priority for the agency, and they emphasized throughout that healthcare providers, those in the healthcare industry, need to be practicing a good cybersecurity hygiene, and I like that analogy. In the healthcare industry, hygiene is important. When working with patients, a doctor or a nurse will wash his or her hands to have proper hygiene when treating a patient, and HHS points out that the healthcare organizations need to practice good cybersecurity hygiene, and to do that, you need to implement good practices and procedures going forward.
Thanks, Derek. You know that you'll notice as we talk today, if your organization follows the National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework, a lot of this will probably look familiar with you. The HHS guidance that we have closely follows that guidance, and so the best practices we're going to be talking about today will look familiar to you. Getting to the reason for why we're going into this is just the prevalence of cyber attacks. So you see the quote on the screen from Eric Hargan, Deputy Secretary, talking about the constant cyber attack, that we're under constant cyber attack in the health sector, and no organization can escape that reality. And it's played out that way. 95% of healthcare organizations have been targeted for a cyber attack. And in the healthcare sector, this is critical because the cost on average for a breach is just over $400 per record. And that is double the cost of other industries. So breaches in the healthcare sector can be extremely costly. In 2017, breaches in the healthcare industry resulted in costs of over $6 billion, and so that's a big part of the driving factor behind this guidance. You'll see that it underestimates that, I think, in this slide 4 and 5. Like I said, 95% of healthcare organizations have experienced some kind of cyber attack. And this is especially important for smaller businesses. More than half of malware attack victims are small businesses. The average cost for small and medium-sized businesses in 2017, over $2 million per incident. That's a huge dollar amount for small and medium-sized businesses to have to address. And so, not surprisingly, you'll see the majority of those small businesses going out of business after a cyber attack. And the bigger concern, and the reason that HHS is pushing this, is that 90% of small businesses don't use data protection for company and customer information in the healthcare industry. That is a critical shortcoming that this is designed to address in a reasonable way.
So we wanted to take a few minutes and to unpack some of this guidance for you, to make you aware of some of the key points of this guidance, and we, having talked about the aims and the why this guidance now, we're going to go into the what and then the how. First of all, the what. The HICCUP guidance is comprised of 4 volumes. One is the HICCUP Managing Threats and Protecting Patients. This provides an overview of the security threats that affect the healthcare industry. There are 2 technical volumes, and there are also resources and templates as well. And there's the resources and templates, as you might imagine, have additional resources and references to be aware of. If you want to do further reading, there's links to further places that you can read and learn more about this. There's also, I have noted there, a Cybersecurity Practices Assessments Toolkit. This has not yet been released by HHS, but it is anticipated it will be released sometime within the next year or so. They haven't given a strict timeline on that. It's important to note a couple of things about this 4-volume publication and each part of it. First, it's important to note that the managing threats and protecting patients, or the main volume, we'll call it, is really meant for a broader audience. This is meant from the C-suite executives and healthcare practitioners and other stakeholders to IT security professionals. And the intent of that particular main volume is to convey to all of those parties that cybersecurity is not strictly an IT problem, but one that has a potential to impact the entire enterprise. And so that main volume discusses the impact of data breaches on business and healthcare organizations, large and small. It is designed to answer the prevailing question, where do I start and how do I adopt certain cybersecurity practices? It also explores the most current and common cybersecurity threats, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Now, the technical volumes are just that, technical, and they are intended for those with technical expertise in organizations' IT or IT security professionals. But they also serve as a guide for organizations on what to ask their IT and or their IT security teams or IT vendors if they don't have IT security teams in-house. The technical volumes also detail certain practices that can be implemented to mitigate against the 5 threats that we're going to talk about in a moment. You notice that the technical volumes, there's 2 of them. There's one that's addressed specifically to small healthcare organizations, and there's one that's addressed to medium or large healthcare organizations. And I think that's important. There's not a one-size-fits-all cybersecurity practice or guidance, and I think that's critically important to understand where you fit. The main hiccup volume does have a chart that helps users determine where do I fit. Am I a small organization? Am I a large organization? Am I a medium organization? And what it does is it has some common attributes of these entities, including their IT capabilities and current cybersecurity investment, to help them determine where do I fit in all of this. Again, the resources and templates volume is just that. It provides some additional resources to read. It does provide a glossary of terms that are commonly used in the cybersecurity space, which I think is helpful so that you can become conversant in speaking about these issues and know what some of these terms mean, as well as it provides some additional guidance and some templates for formulating plans. So let's dive in even deeper. Let's talk about, for a few minutes, the most common and current cybersecurity threats, which the main volume outlines, and they are here. Email phishing attacks, ransomware attacks, loss or theft of equipment or data, insider accidental or intentional data loss, or attacks against connected medical devices. So there's an Internet of Things aspect to this.
And on the ransomware attacks, this is really where you have malware that will deny the user with access to their data. And usually what happens is that the data will be encrypted with a key that's known only to the hacker until some kind of a ransom is paid. And so after the data is encrypted, the ransomware directs the user to pay the ransom to the hacker, and that's usually in some cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. So you can get a decryption key, hopefully. And this happened recently. There was a rural hospital had to replace its entire computer network after a ransomware attack froze all of its electronic health record system. Doctors couldn't review patient medical histories, they couldn't send lab, pharmacy orders, and officials couldn't restore their essential services. and didn't have the funds to pay the ransom that was being demanded. And after they talked with the FBI, after they talked with cybersecurity experts, they ended up just replacing the entire system. And so the impact of a ransomware attack can be devastating.
So we're going to take a few minutes and go into each and examine not each one of these threats, but we're going to give you talk about a few of them. The guidance obviously goes through each one of these in the following way. Sorry. I'm going to go back here for a second.
Sorry, before we move on, we're going to be talking in a little more detail about email phishing attacks, about loss or theft of equipment or data. A couple other things on the data loss, insider data loss, two kinds: accidental and intentional. And these can be honest mistakes. Most email phishing attacks qualify as accidental data loss. Intentional can be caused by loss or theft by an employee or contractor or other user with the objective of getting personal gain or inflicting harm to the organization. That's what that is. And then attacks on connected medical devices too. We're not going to get into that very much, and partly because there's some additional guidance that makes that a really, really deep dive. When this guidance came out from HHS, shortly after that, the Health Sector Coordinating Council also issued a medical device and health IT joint security plan, which goes through in a lot greater detail security issues facing connected medical devices. And so the FDA and manufacturers work together on that to provide guidance. And this is it's a unique issue with medical devices because you have, for instance, an MRI machine that you anticipate using for a decade. And it may be up to snuff with respect to current cybersecurity issues, but what happens 4, 5, 6 years down the road to that device? It's going to be vulnerable as hackers get more and more sophisticated. So what do you do to keep that safe? And that's where that additional guidance comes in. So we're not going to get into that very deeply in our discussion, but be aware that additional guidance is out there.
Okay, so we're going to take a few minutes and talk about a few of these threats in a little more detail, but also talk about sort of some tips and some ways to address them, which are provided in the HICCUP main document. So let's take the first threat, an email phishing attack. So just so you're aware, this is how there are several sections in the main volume, and this is how they're broken down. So it takes the threat and provides a description of the threat. It provides a real-world scenario of when this threat has been realized and the impact that this threat can have. So let's take phishing, for example. Let's define it for you. First, email phishing is an attempt to trick an employee or an individual in the organization into giving out information, and they do this using email. The way that they trick you, or the phishing attack comes, the email appears to come from a legitimate source. Oftentimes this email might be, looks like it comes from the CEO or from the director of HR, for example. And it's slightly different. It has some different spelling in maybe in the at line. It's a little bit different, but they're they're designed to look pretty similar to an email that you would expect to receive. The email usually also includes an active link or a file. It might attach a file, and clicking on the link or the file will either take the user to a website that will solicit sensitive data, login credentials, for example, or that may infect the computer. So that's a description of what the phishing attack is. Let's give you a real-world scenario. An employee receives a fraudulent email from a cyber attacker disguised as an IT support person from a patient billing company. The email tells the employee to click on the link to change some billing software passwords. The employee unwittingly clicks on the link, is directed to a fake login page, and then that login page collects the employee's login credentials, which the attacker will then use to access financial or other patient data. That is a real-world scenario and one which happens and has happened. Now, what is the impact of this? Well, you can see this is one of those impacts. The pediatrician or the doctor or the healthcare provider learns that an attacker has stolen patient data using a phishing attack and has used that data in some criminal behavior to steal the patient's identity. So, I think it's important that they put this threat in these terms, easy to understand and easy to grasp what is happening, so you can understand how you can address these concerns. The guidance also, I thought, provided some pretty helpful quick tips, as it were. These aren't exhaustive, but they are helpful. So each of these threats also comes with a section of some quick tips to help mitigate the threats, and it's organized around what to ask, when to ask it, and who to ask. So, for example, what to ask. For email phishing, for example, it's estimated that the average person receives about 80 emails per day, and it's important to know which of those emails are safe and which are not. So what do you ask? Ask yourself, do you know the sender? As you look at the email, are there spelling or grammatical errors within the email? Oftentimes you can hover over without clicking. You can hover over the link to see what the URL destination is. And if it looks like it's taking you off into some strange URL location, then you ought not to click. And you ought not to click. You should be careful about clicking anyway. When in doubt, do not click. Do not open attachments. And you ought to think about what the processes are for reporting suspicious emails.
On that, let me just interrupt here quickly. If you get something that raises an eyebrow for you, you could also hover over the sender, because frequently now, as these email phishing get more and more sophisticated, you will know the sender. The sender could be the person 2 doors down from you, until you hover over that email address and find out that it's not actually Jim from 2 doors down, but some strange Gmail account that you've never heard of. So even if you know the sender of the email, if anything in the email raises an eyebrow for you, just hover over that sender name, and we've seen multiple examples where the sender name is much different than the actual email that's sending the message.
Yeah, that's a really excellent point. When's the time to ask? I mean, the best time is to have these questions on our minds when we start employment. That is, we should know and understand what are the policies for reporting and looking for suspicious emails at the beginning of employment. That, in an ideal world, that's where it should occur. You should also, at times, verify before opening suspicious email. And what I mean by that is, let's suppose you got an email that you were suspicious about from someone within the organization, and you're a little worried about it. Well, pick up the phone and call that person and say, hey, I want to make sure that this is cleared. That this is legitimate, what you're asking me to do or what you're asking me to send. If you're worried, make that phone call and verify before opening that suspicious email or clicking. Who to ask? I think it's important to share information, to check with colleagues and find out if they received similar fishy emails within the organization. And you should also, obviously, if you have in-house IT security support or some similar point of contact, check with them on that email and to see if it's legitimate before going forward with the request. Another thing I wanted to note these are also organized to point out some vulnerabilities, and each of these sections have a chart of vulnerabilities, the impact that these vulnerabilities have, and some practices to consider implementing to address these vulnerabilities. I think it's important to point out these vulnerabilities are not the same as threats, right? The threats, the 5 threats that we listed there, are threats to all organizations, regardless of their vulnerabilities. But the vulnerabilities are, weaknesses which, if exposed in the right way, could result in some harm as a result of the threat. And sometimes that vulnerability may lead to that harm or that loss. So, for example, in an email phishing attack, some vulnerabilities might be a lack of IT resources for managing suspicious emails as they come in. Again, this is one example of a vulnerability. The impact of that vulnerability, again, could be, stolen credentials used to access sensitive data, or a loss of reputation in the community if this comes out and becomes public. Practices to consider, again, mentioned this a few minutes ago, be suspicious of emails from unknown senders that request sensitive data, either PHI or PII, or emails that include a call to action or stress urgency. So we have seen and heard about, the email from the CFO saying, I need this information immediately. You need to send this immediately, or send it to some third party immediately. And that's not to say that all calls for urgency mean that it's a phishing attack, but you ought to be suspicious and look carefully at those emails so that you don't fall victim to a phishing attack.
All right, let's talk about loss or theft of equipment or data, and this is something that happens on a daily basis, where you will have some device or equipment that is lost or stolen: laptops, smartphones, tablets, flash drives, any kind of device. They're lost on a daily basis, and sometimes they end up in the hands of people who want to do bad things with them. And so you see on the chart, over the first 8 months of 2018, OCR received reports of almost 200 theft cases, and those affected over 2 million individuals. The records related to 2 million individuals were involved in those thefts. Well, let's look at a real-world example of this. HHS pointed to this example of a physician going to a coffee shop and using the public Wi-Fi to review radiology reports. The doctor stands up, goes to the table to get his coffee, comes back, the laptop is gone. And what's happened? Somebody's stolen it. This happened. It was in Texas, and the results were, fortunately, there's not any evidence that any of the identities of these patients had actually been compromised or been stolen. They had been compromised, but had been stolen. But this resulted in a 7-figure fine from OCR for this incident, because that information was unprotected as it was out there and that device was taken. So beyond just the disruption of business, compromising patient safety, there are real financial burdens that you will have to bear if this type of loss occurs in your organization. So that's something that you need to keep in mind, that in addition to losing data, you can lose records, which impacts reputation, of course, and potential fines. So again, on this, what to ask, when to ask, and who to ask, make sure you know your organization's policy, and you need to have a policy in place, and you need to be aware of that before you have sensitive data on your devices. That's something that you have to account for. When do you ask? This is one where, after the fact, once a device is gone, you need to address it immediately. The longer you wait, the greater risk you have of losing sensitive information. And so you'll want to consult with your IT security support staff, similar point of contact, as soon as possible when something like this occurs.
Oh, can you go back there for 1 second? Just
sure.
one thing. I mean, I was talking earlier about cyber hygiene. If you look at that last point, secure virtual private network, and Corey just said the doctor went to the coffee shop and used the public Wi-Fi. Speaking of good cyber hygiene, using the public Wi-Fi when you're looking at sensitive information is not good hygiene. It's a spot where you can get that information hacked, and that's the reason why you ought to look into a secure private data network. That's better cyber hygiene than using the public Wi-Fi, which it can be subject to hackers.
Great point. Great point. All right, and so some vulnerabilities that will set up your organization to have these types of problems from losing or having equipment or data stolen is, one, just not having a clear sense of what is out there. You'll want to make sure that you have inventory and control over the inventory of your data and equipment. Encryption is a way that if something is stolen, it provides a measure of security that the data on that device or equipment won't be used in an improper way. And so there are several other safeguards that HHS notes that you can take, having physical security practices, simple safeguards like computer cable locks, and so forth. So those types of vulnerabilities identified on this page leave your organization open to the loss or theft of equipment or data. And the impact, as we've discussed, you can lose very sensitive patient information or company information, information about your organization. You can lose protected healthcare information, which is, of course, problematic, damage to reputation, lost productivity, and of course, OCR fines or fines from other regulatory agencies. Practices to consider. These are fairly common sense at this level, but make sure that you are encrypting data, make sure you have backups, make sure you have loss prevention tools, and have a well-defined reporting system in the event that there is a loss or theft of data or equipment.
So moving forward, so again, this was designed to just sort of take you through a couple of the threats and how the guidance is looking at these threats. I want to take you through 10 practices that the HHS has published to mitigate the 5 threats that we've talked about, and they are here: implementing email protection systems, endpoint protection systems, looking at access management, data protection and loss prevention, looking at asset and network management, management of your vulnerabilities, looking at putting into place practices for incident response if there is a cyber attack, medical device security, as Corey mentioned, and then having cybersecurity policies. So these 10 practices become the focus of the technical volumes that I mentioned, both technical volume 1 for small healthcare organizations and technical volume 2 for medium and large healthcare organizations. So I want to take you through just briefly a couple of examples of how these are addressed in those technical volumes. So let's take the first one, the first cybersecurity practice, email. Well, actually, let me take you back there for 1 second. I forgot to make one note. It's important to note, I know I have a list of 1 to 10 here, but you should not take this as a list of priorities. And they're not, the HHS, the HICCUP guidance goes out of its way to say they're not prioritized on purpose. And the reason for that is that each organization should be able to assess its current security and risk posture in order to prioritize the practices and to allocate the resources accordingly. It's also important to point out that these practices align with what is known as the NIST framework, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology framework, which is organized around 5 steps for managing cyber threats. And those steps are identifying, protecting, detect, to respond, and to recover. The 10 practices are aligned with that national standard, and they're designed to help answer the question of how to achieve the outcomes identified in the NIST framework, and also these are tailored specifically to the health sector. So let's look at the first practice that's listed there, email protection systems. This is sort of a vignette from the Small Organizations Technical Volume 1, and each of these practices are accompanied by some sub-practices. And so these are sub-practices from the Technical Volume 1 for small organizations that you can put in place to mitigate certain threats. So for example, with email protection systems, it has these recommended sub-practices. Email system configuration, which provides suggestions on how to configure your email system to mitigate for certain threats. So for example, configuring it in such a way as, to avoid free or consumer-based internet systems for email. Ensure that you have a basic spam or antivirus software and that filters are installed or updated. So that's what that email configuration sub-practice is going to. Education, of course, is looking at, before I go to education, let me step back and mention one more thing on configuration. There are ways to configure your email also to alert or tag a message if it's from an external source. And I've seen these tags frequently these days. It says, warning, external email, and it may have a little tag that invites you to stop, read, and think before clicking on any of the links or responding to the email. So moving to sub-practice on education, this involves giving pointers on how to train your employees to know what to look for to avoid phishing attacks, those items that we talked about earlier of what to ask, who to ask, and when to ask them. Training your employees to be able to eyeball messages in an intelligent and cautious way. Phishing simulation, that's another practice or sub-practice, and it is what it indicates. You can, within your organization, have a phishing simulation, so send a phishing, not a real phishing email, but a fake phishing email to your employees to track how they did with the training that they've been given. And the purpose for this is to help improve and to help the staff and employees become human sensors to inform the organization when a real phishing attack occurs. For medium and large organizations, you can see this is the sub-practices that are addressed to those organizations. You can see it's a little bit more detailed, a little bit more sophisticated, which makes sense. I mean, large organizations are going to have a lot more IT running through their organization. They're going to have a lot more vulnerability points, and for that reason, there are these different and I would say enhanced sub-practices for large and medium-sized practices, which makes sense. And again, it's important to look at, for each of these practices, they list the key risks mitigated. So, for example, if we have good, we put into practice these email protection system protocols, then they will mitigate against phishing attacks, against ransom attacks, or against insider accidental or intentional data loss. Just touching on one other of these, of the 10 cybersecurity practices, one important one is cybersecurity policies. And this is a listing of effective policies that you can put in place to mitigate the risk of cybersecurity attack. And this is from Technical Volume 1, again, for small organizations. So you just take a quick look here. You know, do your policies discuss who plays different roles and what those roles and responsibilities are in the organization for both implementing these practices, these cybersecurity practices. Is there a place where the buck stops, as it were, with cybersecurity practices? We've talked about education, put in policies that describe the mechanisms that the organization is going to utilize to train its workforce to look for and to protect against cyber threats and to mitigate. Acceptable use of email, another example. What actions are or are not permitted to execute on email, including detailed descriptions of how email will be used to complete work. The use of personal devices is one, also a hot button. What is the organization's position on use of personal devices? What is the position on the use of information, company information, organization information being used on those personal devices? This sets some expectations of what that usage is. Corey mentioned, the risk of loss of a laptop, for example. What are the policies that apply to our laptops and how these devices are used when we take them to travel or when we're using them in a remote setting? Incident reporting and checklist. What do we do if there is an incident? Who do we call? Who do we report? To whom do we report suspicious activities? These are all, again, the idea here is to let you know, just to give you a flavor of what these practices are and what they entail. And we've given you 2 of 10 of the cybersecurity practices, best practices, that are recommended to mitigate the 5 threats that we talked about at the beginning. And so we're just giving you, again, a flavor for what this looks like. As we wrap up here in a few minutes and are prepared to take some questions, I wanted to just talk, what is the impact of this guidance of HICCUP? What is the impact? Well, let me tell you a couple of things. One, the officials that put out these guidelines and this guidance were careful to point out that the practices outlined in the publication are not de facto requirements that all organizations must implement, but they're designed to be voluntary. They're looking for companies to cooperate and to put these into place. They're careful to point out that it doesn't create new frameworks. It's not reinventing the wheel, but it is putting in a framework, a tested framework, the NIST framework, which I mentioned a few moments ago. It also is careful to point out that the implementation of these practices alone does not guarantee that an organization has met its compliance and reporting obligations under HIPAA. But I think it's important to point out that understanding that they say that these are not requirements, that given the thorough and detailed nature of this guidance, the fact that it's a product of a consensus-based industry and government approach, that it's the product of 150 experts from government and industry, makes me think and appreciate that this HICCUP guidance is an important guidepost, 1, and 2, that this will become the industry standard over time as organizations large and small come to adopt these cybersecurity policies. It will become an industry standard. It is, again, a product of the best thinking of those in the industry. And so, and I think the idea is the idea of this guidance, and the aim is to get healthcare organizations to pay attention to cybersecurity as an important threat, an important objective to mitigate against. Just to close out, one quote I'll read to you that they said in closing of this guidance. It said, "To adequately maintain patient safety and protect our sector's information and data, there must be a culture change and an acceptance of the importance and necessity of cybersecurity as an integral part of patient care."
Just to echo what Derek's been saying, I think you can safely anticipate that if you suffer a cyber attack and there is a loss of information of any sort, that one of the first questions that you're going to get from a regulator or from plaintiff's counsel is, what were you doing to comply with these standards? I think you're going to see that regulators and courts are going to start looking at these standards as guidance for whether your organization was doing what it was supposed to do. And so if you're falling short of those guideposts, that can be problematic. The other point that I would raise is Derek noted, and it's on here, that this doesn't necessarily mean that you've met your compliance and reporting obligations under HIPAA just because you have complied with these guidelines. The more sensitive information you have, the more safeguards you're going to need, and so it's important to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, excellent point. So just a couple of key takeaways, some things that you should do or be thinking about doing. You should really think about developing and implementing a cybersecurity compliance program. You should evaluate your own cybersecurity capabilities within your organization. You should examine the cybersecurity threats and then prioritize what actions you should take and what investments make sense to improve cybersecurity within your organization. I think it's also important, and it cannot be understated that, or overstated, that it's important to share knowledge and best practices across your organizations. Again, to repeat what is being said in the guidance, this is not an IT problem alone. This is an organizational, this is an enterprise problem, and there needs to be communication among different stakeholders within the organization. And then again, it's important to tailor those cybersecurity practices to your unique needs. The way that this was set up was designed so that organizations from all different stripes could look at this guidance and then tailor it to their unique needs, because the big healthcare organization is not going to have the same needs as the small rural healthcare clinic, and vice versa. With that, we're at the end of our presentation. It looks like we have a couple of questions, which I think I'll pull up here. Let me pull them up to see if we have any other questions. Yes. The question is, if your organization's devices are all encrypted, outside of the cost of the device, are there consequences that can happen, or is that a get-out-of-jail-free card? That's a very good question. I think encryption is the first line of defense. I think it's very important that you put into place those technical measures. I do think, and as we've pointed out in this presentation, there is a human element here, and the human element often causes a lot of these breaches. And you can't, I hate to say it, you can't encrypt around that human element, right? When a phishing attack comes, I can have encrypted software and I can have filters, but if it gets through the filter, I need my human sensors, my employees, to know what to do in those situations. Corey?
Yeah, and that's right. And I think that if I remember correctly, and I may not, but if I remember correctly, one of the defenses that physician used in the example that I gave about having the laptop stolen was that the physician couldn't remember if the encryption software was actually working, if he had locked the laptop or if it had just been left on the table with information open and accessible to anybody that had taken it. And so the device had been lost, and there was no way to confirm if the encryption software was actually protecting the data. And that was a big problem because while the hospital that employed the physician was able to point out that there didn't appear to have been any identity theft, they still couldn't guarantee that that was the case. and as a result of that, and actually a couple other sort of systemic issues, they ended up being fined for that. So, no, I don't think it's a get-out-of-jail-free card. Yes, it's an important factor, and if you can demonstrate in the event a device is lost or stolen that all the data on there was in fact encrypted at the time, that's going to be a significant good factor for you.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, I think it's also important in that instance, if you can demonstrate that you have trained individuals, as to what to do, you have that policy in place, I think that gives you an extra level of protection, right? So let's say that doctor lost that laptop. I would hope that the facts were such that he knew, okay, I lost the laptop, what do? I immediately contact my IT security personnel, and if there are ways that we can mitigate that risk, let's do it. Let's say, and maybe the laptop's not a good example, let's say I lost a personal device, a smartphone. Is there a way to lock that down, even if some of that data is encrypted? Is there a way to wipe the phone remotely? And what procedures or what processes were implemented? But very good question. Another question I see, recommendations for phishing test solutions. That's a really great question. That's one. Actually, I can see the name of the individual who's asked that question. I might ask internally. We have a few vendors who we have recommended people to in the past, and maybe I answer that one directly to the individual who posed that question. But the answer is yes, we can give some recommendations for those testing solutions. And I will say, these testing organizations, I think, they're not all that hard to implement within your organization, and I don't think they're tremendously expensive. In fact, I've got one of our participants here saying Sophos Phish threat is a very effective training. So Sophos, S-O-P-H-O-S, Phish, P-H-I-S-C-H, threat is the name of it, and I think that's great. Thank you for that recommendation. Another one of our participants has recommended KNOWBE4, K-N-O-W-B-E 4, the number 4 for phishing tests. So I think that's a really wonderful. Thank you for that participation and for putting that in there. Let's see if there are other questions here.
Okay, and so one of the questions, are there grants or ASPR funding available? I'm not aware of any.
I'm not aware of any either. And I assume you're speaking of funding available to do cybersecurity, to implement that within your organization. I guess this doesn't answer your question directly, but I think at a minimum, I think it's important, even if you don't, and I think there's a recognition of this because of how the guidance is organized, there's a recognition that that small organizations are not going to be able to throw a ton of money at this, and that makes sense. And that's why they tailor some of this guidance to small organizations versus medium and large organizations. So I think in that instance, I think it behooves you in those small organizations to read and consider the guidance and to look at the technical volume 1 and again prioritize where are your vulnerabilities and where should I be putting my dollars in investing in this. So I know that doesn't perfectly answer your question, but I think it's an important point to make. Let me look at a couple others here. How would you recommend educating staff? Most staff don't understand the importance of situations until they actually experience it. How would you educate a physician or safe practices? Some physicians are reluctant to change. Again, those are very good points. We're dealing with people here. We're dealing with people from different backgrounds. I think it's important if you, as a leader of an organization, are making this a priority and not making this the IT's problem, quote unquote, and you make these initiatives important in your own organization, then your employees will, or your physicians will, I hate to say it this way, but will be compelled to make some changes and to take these things seriously. I do think it's important to train them like you would on other risks that are important to your organization. I mean, you might have, for example, a sexual harassment training for your employees, and you would have that training because it's important, right? And because there's some legal risk there if your employees violate some of those laws. Well, this should be treated no differently. There's a risk there, and those employees can be trained in these in being educated as to these processes and procedures. I think it's also important to that it won't come. So if you can set up the training, but you can have a third party come in, like us, to come in and present to your staff on the importance of these things and drill down on what it is that's most important and critical to your organization on this. So, again, a long answer to a question, but I think it's important to set, in what I've seen in implementing these procedures, it's important to set the right tone at the top, right? If it's important at the top of the organization and it's important that and that's communicated to all members of the organization, then the organization is more likely as a whole to take these things seriously, to make sure that they're trained, and to try to mitigate these risks. And so I think that's an important thing to consider.
And I think the other thing that you can do is try to take out the human element of this as much as you can with your IT. I appreciate that people don't like to change their practices. I struggle with that as well. And you can oftentimes find IT solutions that will help to minimize human error. For instance, making sure that if you have any device associated with your organization that has sensitive material on it, that it automatically locks out after a certain period of time. That may be frustrating for people who are staring at their smartphone and all of a sudden it locks, but it's something that you can do to enhance the safety of that data to hopefully bypass human error as best you can.
One final question before we close this up. Will these slides be available? The answer is yes. These slides will be available. We often do a post-webinar email to attendees. We also provide this on our HH Health blog website. Let me go to the next slide, which is here, hhhealthblog.com. These can be accessed. The slides will be available there, as well as a recording of this presentation, and so you can go there and get that information. If there are other questions, unless there are any other questions, we're gonna finish for today. Thank you very much for participating in today's webinar. We appreciate your attendance today, your questions. If you have other questions, please feel free to reach out to either Corey or myself through our information there, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you again for being part of this presentation. Have a nice day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.